Hey folks, this is Dr. Emily Scherning with American Resiliency, here with a regional cross-model outlook for the Northeast. We're going to talk about projected changes to this important region, both as we approach 2C of baseline global warming and in the event that we hit one of the best understood climate tipping points. So, as you may know, the Northeast is extremely full of people. Here's a figure from the USGS about that. Now, this is from 2010, so the population and the density have really only increased. You can see from the coloring there that there's extreme population density along the coast, particularly in the greater New York City area, including New Jersey. As we'll see, some of these extremely populated areas are going to be vulnerable to even 1 foot of sea level rise, meaning that for this region, for the Northeast more than any other region, sea level rise has the potential to set off a very expensive and unpleasant game of musical chairs in the housing market. So as I look to weave you the story of the likely changes to come in this region, that's got to be one essential thread, is where does sea level rise look like a big problem, and where does it look like a relatively manageable problem? Philadelphia stands out to me as the biggest city near the water in this region with manageable impacts. I've also been surprised to see relative stability along the coast of Connecticut compared to, say, Boston or Long Island, where things look potentially quite bananas. I think another critical point to cover is where is it staying cool in the summer? Because sure, there are some hot spots to be found in the Northeast. That's a stacked threat on New York City right there, is significant projected heat increases on top of sea level rise issues. And Delaware, the whole state is looking weirdly toasty in the 2C projections, picking up a very Carolina-like quality. But a lot of the Northeast, I would say the majority of the Northeast, looks quite stable for summer temps, and that's good news. Probably the third biggest threat of interest in the region is going to be your projections for deluge-type rain, for serious flooding rains. And folks who live in Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, you're probably going to like this if you're someone who's been thinking about moving to Maine, Vermont, or New Hampshire. These states look like they have enough to deal with, and they do not have time to put together a muffin basket for you, especially in Maine. We've got some serious hotspots for deluge-type flooding in the projections at 2C, as you will see. And hear me, folks, up there at the tip there in the far Northeast, I am not saying anything bad about you, okay? I think there's a lot of potential in your subregion, especially in southern Vermont. But what I hear from the ground is that y'all are pretty full up. And so that's the message that I want to put out there, is that capacity is limited and that you really can't take in a lot more people in that part of the Northeast. No, if you're thinking about relocating in or to the Northeast, I want to tell you where I think you should go. And that's the areas you can see here within and around that squiggly line, which is our designated Lifeboat 2. This is an area with potential to take in more people without overshooting the water supply, an area with the potential to sustainably take in more people, to build a food system to support more people, an area with communities that have the potential to cultivate and develop their, in many cases, already strong local food systems. There will be change in this bounded area for sure, but this and Lifeboat 1 in the northern Midwest, they're the largest, most stable regions in the country with intake capacity that I have been able to draw out from the overall national level projection information. Lifeboat 2 here, this is a cool place. There are a range of lifeways that could take form within this large area. In the higher elevation areas, those are going to preserve a classic 4 seasons climate with potential for sugaring through 2C. In the lower elevation areas, we're talking about them taking on almost a Piedmont-like quality with milder winters and ability to overwinter more types of crops. We're talking about changes throughout the region for sure, but these are changes that come with potential, not only loss. All right, let's nerd out and get into some details here. Sea level rise first, we're going to model the coast at 3 feet, which is a pretty reasonable number to be concerned about in a conventional warming scenario. We might see that in our lifetimes without any tipping point feedback and at 10 feet. Because if we have hit a tipping point in the Earth's ocean circulation systems, if the melt trends we're noticing in Antarctica keep playing out as aggressively as we're seeing these last 2 years, we need to take high-end sea level rise information quite seriously. I'm using a .org tool to model this today, coastalclimatecentral.org. This tool has worldwide functionality, and my experience with it is that it's highly stable, that anytime you get on it, it's going to work. All right, I've got it dialed up to 3 feet before we zoom in. We're going to take a minute and look at impacts to DC, to Philadelphia, to the greater New York City, New Jersey area, and to Boston. Except for Philly, I'm warning you now, this is all going to suck. Then we'll check a little bit further up once you get off the continental shelf, and you'll see there's a little bit better news further up the coast. I will also say the coastline looks better further south as you move into the southeast. There are parts of the southeast that are not getting hammered as hard by these impacts as we're going to see around, say, New Jersey, where some of America's most vulnerable coastlines are found. All right, so we're zooming in here now, starting around the DC area, and you can see that this whole peninsula around Maryland and Delaware, we're seeing pretty extensive land loss. If you check out the Delaware state level video, you will see that this is going to be impacting major regional infrastructure. But let's focus on DC for a minute. At 3 feet, you can see that things are getting dicey, that probably the sub-basements of the Smithsonian, for example, are going to be struggling to not take on water. And if you're outside of this zoomed in area, you should go and look because there are impacts all the way upriver, and you can use tools like this to look at address level information on how it may impact your neighborhood. Just because your house looks okay, of course, it doesn't mean that everything is fine. A person who's very concerned about sea level rise issues, I would recommend talking to your local water utility to see how high above the current mean higher high water mark level your sewage outflows are. I think the most serious and direct impact that many of us will experience on the coast from sea level rise are increased sewage backups. Nasty. Let's look at 10 feet. Dialing it up to 10 feet, you can see that in this higher end sea level rise scenario, we really have some fairly serious problems, including infrastructure damage that includes the airport and major challenges on the National Mall, where there would be a need to defend, to move millions and millions of dollars and priceless elements of our national shared heritage. So when we look to our culture, our history, our American identity, these higher end sea level rise scenarios become very serious. And let me show you another way that's so, is that if we zoom out, you can see that many of our coastal wildlife refuges will be lost, that much precious habitat will be lost. And we need to preserve the potential for life in the Chesapeake Bay. This is potentially one of the most bioactive systems in the US. And if we want to talk about sustainable lifeways, we need to try and keep these estuary areas in play. Where I see red on this map, I see a need to think about and prepare for future conservation scenarios, a need to look for what marsh areas are emerging and begin to protect them now for the future of our heritage. Heading north a little bit, you can see the size of the infrastructure challenge regionally is going to be just awful at 10 feet. But let's zoom in and look at Philadelphia at 3. So at 3 feet of sea level rise, you can see that New Jersey is taking more than its share of the direct damage of the inundation type impacts, and that a lot of the built environment of Philadelphia is going to be pretty untouched. I also, using other tools, have not seen significant marshiness emerging inland around Philadelphia, indicating, I think, a better chance that there's not going to be saltwater incursion into the systems from which people in Philadelphia are drinking. Let's look at this a little more closely. So all along the Delaware River, there are some vulnerabilities. And as we move up to 10 feet of sea level rise modeling, we can see the damage to the built environment is limited, including many of the culturally significant areas of Philadelphia. The damage to infrastructure will be a big problem. So the regional flows, that's going to be a big problem. But you can see that a lot of the real estate here looks intact. A lot of the housing looks intact. And try and keep this in your mind's eye as we prepare to go over and look at New York, because the level of damage we're talking about here, even at 10 feet of sea level rise, is less than we're going to expect to the greater New York City area at 3 feet. All right, checking that out. You can see that in this highly populated area at 3 feet, your biggest damage is going to be in New Jersey and along Long Island. The southern coast of Long Island is going to get hammered by sea level rise. And there are a lot of very expensive properties there, meaning that there is going to be a disproportionately gigantic impact on the home insurance market. Let's see what happens when we dial it up to 10. The first time that I looked at 10 feet of sea level rise for this area, I was astonished by how much direct inundation we're likely to see in New Jersey, in a very dense built environment part of New Jersey. Zooming in on the city, you can see that we're also going to have direct inundation in many parts of the city. Just scrolling around here, you can see another airport loss. It's going to be such a big problem to lose all of this infrastructure at once. If we're dealing with high-end sea level rise, we're talking about threats to Reagan, LaGuardia, and many more airports. And even at 3 feet, we got to remember that these are structures that have extensive sub-basements. And at 3 feet of sea level rise, you're going to start to lose foundational integrity to this crucial infrastructure. Looking down here, you can see JFK is also going to be having big problems, and that you're losing the local wildlife refuge as well in these high-end sea level rise scenarios. All right, that was a little much for me. I'm putting it back down to 3 feet before we go look at Boston. On the way there, you can see the relative all-rightness of this coastline with Connecticut and Rhode Island. It's not like they got no problems, but they're pretty resilient. Check them at 10. Way less of a difference than we just saw in New York and New Jersey, right? They look pretty good. And here's Boston, where not only do we see a fair amount of direct damage at 3 feet, you can't see it so well in this viewer, but we see also extensive marshiness, extensive changes to the water table well inland in this area at 3 feet. And at 10, you can see we're talking about losing the entire downtown. We're talking about Boston needing a seawall if they're going to preserve any of the built environment. When I look at the projections for Boston and the level to which the water table is going to change before we hit direct inundation for Boston, I think that many people who are interested in this area for its many cultural strengths should know that from a resilience perspective, you're deciding if you want to fight the sea or not. And then getting up here, further up the coast, you can kind of see where that lower lying continental shelf hugging area falls away, and we start to see lower levels of damage again. Let's pump it up to 10 and crawl up the coast a little bit, and you'll see the relative stability along much of Maine. We're at about the same level of resolution where we saw those really serious impacts to New Jersey. I didn't visualize it, but the impacts to Atlantic City are terrible at 1 foot. You can see that even in Portland here, we're talking about relatively limited damage to the built environment. We're talking about pretty decent preservation of infrastructure at 10 feet as we get further up into Maine. If you want to really have fun, you want to get all the way up to Bangor, this is Bangor at 10. Looks okay. So, folks, I'm glad we're done looking at that. And even if your house looks okay in these projections, these problems look expensive. So I think it all makes it fairly clear why I do not have coastal areas in the low change boundaries of the lifeboat regions, right? When we're talking about sea level rise, we're talking about expensive infrastructure problems. If you want to see the detailed impact of that, you're going to want to look at the state level video about Delaware if you want to get into the nitty gritty. Those major highway interchanges, they look like a state budget nightmare and a major regional transportation issue. If your state is going to need to put billions of dollars into infrastructure repair, that seems likely to impact your taxes and your availability of state services. So using Massachusetts just as an example, the Berkshires look great in terms of climate. Honestly, the all-around outlook there is very nice. But as we saw, Boston looks to be facing really significant sea level rise issues, not to mention the potential damage to Cape Cod, even in a 3-foot scenario. So the overall stability for the Berkshires from factors beyond climate is going to take a push. I hope that makes sense. This has been a depressing segment, especially those 10-foot visuals around New York. We got to remember that sea level rise is not going to crash on us like a wave. It's going to creep up from below. There's time to respond. It's not going to unfold like the movie Day After Tomorrow, which is a good thing, because at this point, I don't know that Mexico would still be as friendly and helpful as they are in the film. Let's look at something more cheerful for the region, the hot season outlook. So check this out. We're going to start looking at this with days that are hot, days over 100 degrees. And in this visualization, it's like we're working metal, where black is cool, white is hot. You can see how none of those 100-degree days there are in those 2C projections for the majority of the Northeast. And when we look at other parts of the country, we see pretty scary hot season projections. There are very few regions actually as cute as you in terms of projected days over 100 at 2C. And that's just one hot season factor. In Arizona, we're talking about a total 90-day hot season extension projected at 2C, even if you enjoy the heat. That's pushing Arizona's already very long hot season out to like March through December. And we're seeing right now in Phoenix, they had their first 100-degree day already in early April. Don't normally see that until May. It stinks to see this unfolding on the ground. There are areas that are higher change than others, and I think that all of us are interested in identifying those lower change areas. They're very important. When I started exploring the Northeast, the lack of intense heat in the projections really stood out to me as a strength in the region, a strength that will help compensate for the regional vulnerability to sea level rise. Zooming in there and focusing on just the region, we can see where there are days over 100 in the projections where we start to see this blush, and that is between the mountains and the sea with impacts to DC, coming up the coast into New York City. Let's zoom in on DC for a minute, because anyone who's spent time there knows that it gets pretty sweltery. And at 2C, we're looking at notable increases, notable days over 100, like 3 additional days over 100 throughout the county. And we have extra visualization for some of the more densely built urban areas where we expect heat island impacts, more than 10 days over 100 by 2C. Moving up to New York City, it's not as bad as that, but it is still hot with a couple of days solidly over 100 in the projections at 2C. So it's good to know that you're part of the region that has these projected days over 100 is fairly confined. So let's look at the regional discomfort level in your projected summer. Your days that are over 95, but under 100, and your projected increase in warm nights. Nights where it's not going to cool off below 70, and people are going to feel better with the AC on. So switching to number of days over 95, those uncomfortable days, we can see that in New York City, we're looking at more than a week of intense discomfort where it's over 95 and then add on a couple of days over 100. Let's zoom out a little bit so that you can see that that warming trend is going to be true all through this coastal area. Philadelphia, similar levels of warming. DC taking on more, taking on about twice as much. And then as we move up the coast, we can see there is a faint blush of these uncomfortable days throughout the region, more of it by the coast, a little bit more of it as we get inland from the Great Lakes. But in your high elevation areas, there are very, very few of these warm days projected. I think that it's worth taking a look at Boston, where we're seeing a little bit less than a week of additional days over 95, but we see a large number of increased nights over 70. We're seeing a couple of weeks for that in Boston. And if you're going more than a week over 95, more than a week where it doesn't cool down at night, that's where you're talking about a real need for air conditioning from a public health perspective. If the human body can't cool down at night, it's harder to endure that heat during the day. Populations that are particularly vulnerable include little kids, older folks, people with heart and lung conditions. If they're in that extended heat and they can't cool down, their resilience to the heat reduces. They have a harder time recovering. And those warm nights, we can see that they come in from the lake and they come in from the sea. Everywhere that you're looking at yellow on this map, everywhere where you're looking at yellow on this map, we're talking about air conditioning not being a luxury, being a necessity from a public health perspective as we move towards 2C. That is going to increase strain on your grid. It's not as bad as some regions, but we are talking about multiple weeks where most people are going to want 24/7 air conditioning in the summer. So focusing here on Syracuse for a minute, a place with a really strong climate outlook, you can see that they're looking at a little bit less than a week of additional nights over 70 and maybe 3 additional days over 95. So this will be uncomfortable. People will complain about this change, but this is also an extremely survivable outlook. And in a 2C world, survivable really means something. So to restate clearly, in terms of the biggest thing we think is likely to kill people in a warming world, the heat, your region honestly checks out great if you look at the national average, let alone the global average. And I think that even in your higher change places, as you're looking at DC, as you're looking at New Jersey, DC, when the nation was founded, that was kind of the place where the northern and southern climates and cultures came together, right? When we look at the shift, It looks like that mixing point has gone up to a midpoint of New Jersey. So if you're thinking about the future of Maryland, of New Jersey, thinking about the Carolinas in the 90s are going to help you understand where the trends are pointing. Because these changes can look scary, but even in areas we're talking about pretty intense warming trends like that, it's not like next stop Phoenix. We're talking about a fairly nearby climate analog where the landscapes aren't so unfamiliar, where a future can be envisioned. I think that it's really important that throughout the Northeast, when we're talking about the change landscape, we're talking about in-range climate analogs. I think that that's a really important stabilizing piece of information to hold on to. So, all right, we looked at one way you're vulnerable to sea level rise. We looked at one way you look pretty good with high-end heat increases very limited for much of the region. Now I want to talk about another type of water vulnerability, deluge-type rain, and I'm sorry to say, hurricanes. Let's take a quick look at this figure from the previous National Climate Assessment, the NCA4. You can see here there's a very conserved projected hurricane track cruising right up the coast. These inland hurricanes are bad news. We've seen hurricane remnants and tropical storms hit along near the coast in the Northeast occasionally throughout living memory. They come up into Pennsylvania. Everyone remembers Superstorm Sandy, and everybody remembers Hurricane Helene. These storms, they're extremely dangerous and destructive. You can see on those lower figures there that that is not a remnant or a tropical storm projected to move all the way up into Virginia and Maryland. That yellow line indicates a full strength Category 1 hurricane, potentially getting all the way up in Virginia. It's not beyond imagining that given the wrong conditions, you get a hurricane hitting DC. But responding to a more serious concern in the region, let's talk about flooding from deluge-type rains. These have been so serious for Vermont, just heartbreaking. It's an increasing problem in Connecticut. It's a known regional issue. So this is figure 2.12 from the NCA5. It's going to give us some more insight on where these deluge-type rains are likely to fall as we approach 2C. On this complex figure, there are two places to highlight as especially vulnerable to serious deluge-type rain. We've got a cluster impact in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, with projected impacts the most serious in these points in Maine. Look, you can see the repeating pattern at the tip and on the coast and right by the border. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Not as dark, but still looking bad in Maine there. Most serious deluge type rain in the projections for 2C when we're talking about that region. And we've got a bad spot here. Conserved danger signals right by New York and New Jersey, right where we've got the harbor, right where we've got this area that's so vulnerable to sea level rise, where we already have a flooding threat. So if you're at risk in the New York, New Jersey area there, I would be concerned and I would be responding to this threat of water, considering relocating from that particularly vulnerable region. If you're concerned about these issues, resilience building will be very difficult if you're near the coast in those areas. There's also a lot of the Northeast that's looking kind of darker than average on all three of these subfigures, right? And that's a sign that flooding rain, deluge type rain, is likely to be the resilience challenge throughout the region. There's a bright spot. There's kind of a nice window where we don't expect deluge type rain around Albany, which is cool. But otherwise, if your house ever floods now, if there's anything you can do to mitigate that, this is a good time to take action. And if you're thinking about moving to this area, get really serious about digging into what has happened in the area where you're thinking about moving when it's flooded before. Find out how water currently moves through the area, what routes water is currently taking. And if you can't find a neighbor to talk to when you're out on the ground, I'm going to suggest you go be real nice at the local post office and see if they'll tell you, because they're out on the ground all the time in all kinds of weather. If you can get a local to talk to you about where it floods bad now, you could get some valuable intel and you could start building positive connections with people in the area. All right, so Northeast as a region, you look wet and you look like all the boring non-coastal in your areas are going to experience a time to shine. Inland northeastern cities like Albany, like Scranton, like Hartford, they have some strong outlooks, some of the best in the nation. And you need to know that flooding is going to be kind of your major resilience challenge. When we talk about the lifeboat regions, I think it's reasonable to say, big picture, deluge type rain and flooding are an important focus for resilience building in the built environment. In the Lifeboat region in the Midwest, we have the potential for more drought, more heat waves than you do in the Northeast. Everywhere's got some kind of problems. But when we look at relative stability all around the world, these are important places to build a good future, a future that respects life, a future that is centered on the earth. So that's the 2C projections. How about the tipping point projections? Many scientists now are interpreting the evidence coming out of the world's oceans. The AMOC collapse is looking more likely by 2050. That's a change in the circulation patterns of the world's oceans that will be no fun from a global or a human civilization type perspective. From what modeling we have, in the Northeast, we would expect a mild drought trend and a cooling trend that would push against the continued warming that we would expect. We might see more of a classic Northeastern climate return with stronger winters again. And maybe those things don't sound so bad. I mean, you got a lot of water problems now, right? And they might not be so bad. But the real butt kicker for the Northeast in the event of this tipping point would be that higher end sea level rise. That's when we got to start thinking about 10-foot plus scenarios with that total infrastructure destruction. When we looked at the 10-foot modeling, the way we're going to see that in our lifetimes would be if we continue to see the current signs of AMOC collapse unfold, including the way higher than normal levels of melting that we are beginning to observe in the Arctic these last couple of years. Looking down a little bit, here in North America, I'm concerned about the increased velocity potential of the winds, particularly in the southeast in the event of AMOC collapse. I'm concerned that this could be a time of catastrophic storms, very powerful and damaging winds with the storms. You heard earlier in this report that we might be expecting more inland hurricanes entering the Northeast anyway. If you're in an area that's ever had a hurricane remnant come in, there's cultural memory to be found in that, because those flooding events are so serious that they transform communities. Preparing against not only water, but also wind seems like a potentially prudent step for building resilience in parts of the Northeast where you have a sense that the winds might change. Folks, thanks for spending some time looking at this projection info with me. Overall, I think there's a lot of great potential in the Northeast, but thinking about water, that's just going to be key to your region's overall resilience. Water from the sky and water from the sea. If we're talking about high-end sea level rise, there's no use fighting the sea. The solution is to get back from the water. If you're in an area like Atlantic City that looks bad at 1 foot of sea level rise, I get my holdings out of there, or I go full boat person. Any reaction seems fine to me, but you gotta react. You can't pretend this level of change isn't coming at you. The great cities of the East Coast, many of them look quite seriously threatened by sea level rise, and the cascading impacts of damage to regional infrastructure shouldn't be underestimated. I think there will be a migration inland. Now's a good time to get started on that if you're personally interested. But I also think that there are many ways to get weird in this weird timeline on which we find ourselves. When we look at those higher end sea level rise scenarios, we're looking at very serious changes to Puerto Rico, especially around San Juan, as well as big changes to New York City we've talked about in this video. Those ladies selling piragua in the city, they're ahead of the game on this changed landscape. I think we're coming into a future where imagination is important, both to face the challenges and the opportunities ahead. You all know we're in it now. It's time to respond to change. Let's take a step today. Folks, thanks for watching, and thanks to everyone in the AR community who keeps this channel going. The donors, the volunteers, people spreading the word online, and especially everyone doing the work on the ground. Financially, AR is a donor-supported organization. We don't take grant funding, and I want you to know your support really matters. If you'd like to donate, please check out the link on our website, www.americanresiliency.org, or on the About page of our YouTube channel. I'll look forward to talking with you again soon.